The next presenter is Reiko Hayashi, Director of Department of International Research and Cooperation at National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, will raise questions about today's theme. Director Hayashi, if you please. I am Hayashi at National Institute of Population and Social Security Research. Today I would like to pose 3 points as following. The first point is about trends in international migration comparison between Japan and the world. This is a sketch showing the current situation of international migration, showing the movement of the world population, and this point will be explained later on by Professor Hugo. Overall, it shows that the world population was 1.5 billion people on 1990. International migration and the places where immigrants were have been growing and eventually hit 2.1 billion people in the whole world by 2010. At the point of 2010, Europe and North America shows the highest number, and Asia has approximately 61 million immigrants. The half of it is West Asian nations such as Israel, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. Unstable nations, high number of refugees, and the other half, which is very important in this sense, is the number of immigrants at oil-producing nations on the Gulf, such as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. This summarizes the characteristics of current international migration. As mentioned before, the number of international migration is steadily growing. Previously, male migrants were the majority on international migration, such as for work, but according to the statistics, there are as many female migrants as male migrants. There are a lot of situations that could put female migrants in weak positions. Therefore, there is an international measure to protect the human rights of female migrants and carry out the migration policies accordingly. The circular migration, such as what we say in Japan, U-turns and J-turns, are internationally increasing. Short-term migration, immigrate for short-term and come back in a few years. Additionally, the urban-rural linkage, the trips between the destination countries and the sending countries are increasing. Organic linkage is made between the destination countries and the nations migrants came from. The next point is the usual stereotypes of immigrants movement is from the developing countries to the developed countries. However, currently the immigrants' directions became multiple, such as from developing countries to developing countries, developed countries to developing countries, and developed countries to developed countries, such as EU. People's movement became stimulated beyond borders since 2000. The same can be said about ASEAN member nations. The regional integration has a side of international migration, but we should focus on this side as well. In the area of development assistance, the amount of remittance by international migrants exceeded the amount of ODA around the year of 2000. The technology transfer by returnees and the people who worked in the developed nations came back and started businesses. By applying their skills, the economic development effect is expected, and UN took this into their consideration, and the resolutions was given on 2008 in order to carry out the migration policies accordingly. On the other hand, there are problems such as brain drain. People who went to developed countries and gained skills and education do not come back to their home countries. Such issues of international migration could be caused by the shortage of job opportunities in their home countries. Thus, they have no choice other than leave their countries. Other than this issue, there is a refugee problem, but forced migration needs to be solved. This is the current world opinion.
Then there are many theories concerning international migration. This is the overview. Amongst the many, I have only identified these major three theories. One theory is of neoclassical economics. Main drivers are earnings and employment, the disparities. People move from higher to lower to higher income possibility countries. And the second theory is the dual labor market theory. What we saw, the 3D jobs, demanding, dirty, and difficult jobs, have the opportunities for immigrant workers. And the third one is the world systems theory, with the globalization and also development of the modes of transportation. The people's trips and the traffics have been very active. And then the new economics migration and network theory also emerged. And on the side of the population models, we also have international migration turnaround theory. So the turnaround, this is a shift from turnaround from net migration to in-migration by economic and social changes. And also from the high birth rate to lower birth rates. So this is also another famous theory of migration. And after the demographic transitions, some argue that second and third transitions occur. And as a result, we see changes in the ethnic components and also the increase of other ethnicities or new ethnicities in the communities. And this shows the international migration stock or population to total population of all countries in 2010. As you can see, Europe, North America, the nations where they have a higher percentage of migrants, but China, India, and also the Southeast Asian nations and the other Asian countries are mostly white or the very light blue, with the exception of Malaysia and Singapore, where they have a higher percentage of the foreigners. And then if you compare Asia and Africa, perhaps the across borders migration is also very active, and so the economic development is not followed in Asia by higher mobility of people. And this shows international mobility by origin and destination of the countries with more than 10 million people. And horizontally, we see the percentage of the people of the other or nationalities, and also the horizontally we have the destination. So vertically Japan has 1.7% of the foreigners, but horizontally you see the number of the people of your nationality living outside of your country. Saudi Arabia and such the Gulf, Persian Gulf countries have a higher percentage of the foreigners. So we have listed here the only Saudi Arabia amongst the Gulf nations because of the population size, but Oman and Qatar and other Gulf countries, for example, Qatar and Kuwait, is a good example because 75% of their population are accounted for by people from other countries. This is one type. And another typology is the second one, represented by Canada and Australia. But New Zealand should be here, but it's not included because of the smaller population side. And the United States is within the European countries. And these countries are so-called migrant, the countries of migrants. The United States percentage is relatively low, but the total size of the population is large. So the absolute number of foreigners living in the United States is larger than in Canada and Australia. And the other groups are so-called European countries, Spain, Germany, France, and Netherlands, and where the foreigners represent about 10% of the total population. And then Japan is the bottom group. This is now enlarged in the next page. As you can see here, the foreigners represent in Japan at about 1.7% of the total population according to the foreigners registration system. But how about the other neighboring countries? South Korea is here. Korea is praised highly for good immigration policy, but the foreigners' percentage of the total population is lower than Japan, only 1.1%. But this shows the high percentage of Korean people go to other countries. About 50% goes into the United States, and 1/4 coming to Japan. How about China? Chinese presence is very growing globally, but the total size of the population is quite large. So the percentage-wise, the incoming, inbound, outbound, both are very small, and Vietnam as well. The percentage is very low. And in both of these countries, foreigners represent only 0.1%. And that is the same as Cuba. These three countries have the lowest the percentage of the foreign residents living in their own countries. And but Japan, Korea, and Vietnam have had the long resident registration systems. And in these countries, the foreigners are also registered rather tightly. That is partly because of the lower percentage of the foreigners in these countries. So this is what I call the East Asian nations with the traditional family registration system. And India and Brazil are so-called emerging economies, members of BRICS. How are they faring? The foreigners' percentage is not that particularly high. But in Russia belongs to the European group in this picture. But as you can see here, the economic development of the emerging economies are not associated with a higher percentage of foreigners in particular. And so, as I said, if the economic development progresses, then there more or less becomes open for the foreigners. This shows the GNI per capita horizontally, and vertically you have the population of international migrants. This is the Japanese the situation. Despite the higher level of economic development, the foreign migrants percentage is rather low, and the triangles show the Korea, so Japan and Korea. They have quite a lot of the similarities. And then I'd like to go on to the next point of my argument, the aspects of international migration in Japan. And this shows the trend of a number of foreigners in Japan. And if you compare trends of Japan and then the foreigners, well, of course, the Professor Ishikawa will go into the details of the comparison between Japan and other countries. But in the 1990s, we saw the sharp increase of the foreigners coming into Japan very rapidly. But 2008 was the peak, and in the following year, the number turned to the downward partly because of the Lehman shock, and also the great earthquake in 2011. And this year, the data available are not conclusive yet, but as some suggest that the number increased last year, but we are yet to see the conclusive results. The green shows the non-permanent residents. Yes, we see the sharp decrease of this the category since 2009. So what's going on in Japan is quite contrasting to what's going on globally. But the red graph shows the permanent residents have been steadily increasing since 2000. The number is now reaching nearly 1 million today. And then, what are the characteristics and issues of international labor migration to Japan?
Now, some of the feature is to just fill in the shortage in the labor and to promote highly skilled workers. But we are not sure whether there is shortage of labor really in Japan. Our next feature is the permanent residents, and that is giving visa status of long-term residents to Japanese descendants from like Brazil, and relaxing the conditions for acceptance of technical interns. So this kind of long-term residents and interns, they are now becoming a labor force for Japan, but this is really a gap from the original intention. And Professor Akashi will talk about it. And also, Japan has a very strict border control as an island country. Our challenge is how to further promote the acceptance of highly skilled workers. This is true in all countries. All countries really want highly skilled workers, and there is a fierce competition between the countries to get highly skilled workers. Next challenge is integration policy for resident foreigners. We do not have a good integration policy. And in Japan, we do not really use the word immigrants. So how do we build integration policy? And what are the characteristics and issues of non-labor-oriented migration to Japan? First is the difficulties in identifying the non-labor-oriented migrants. As I mentioned, the Nikkei, the Japanese Brazilians, they are interns and students in Japan, but they really work in Japan, and we do not know how many of them really work or learn. And compared with Western countries, there is not that much visa granted based on the family reunion, and decreasing number of international marriage. since 2007. I will talk about that issue later, and Professor Inoue will also talk about this issue. And also, Japan has low admission of refugees. In 2012, we only had 18 new refugees, and only 122 applicants were granted humanitarian residence permit. Now, what are the institutional issues for integration of foreigners into Japanese society? Features are integration of foreign residents in basic resident registration system since July 2012, and ensured coverage of Social Security, and no opportunity for technical interns for further career, and long duration required to obtain the status of permanent residence, and also jus sanguinis principle and prohibition of dual nationality, and no coherent migration policy. So the challenge is we need integration policy, and we need measures to prevent discrimination based on nationality. Now I would like to talk about our system. This is the registration and social security coverage of foreigners in Japan. And the UN Commission on Population and Development had a resolution in January this year, and it promotes the access to education, healthcare, and social services for foreigners. But the present social security coverage is not really optimal in Japan. One is that there is low level of enrollment of foreigners into pension or association managed health insurance. And the national health insurance or public assistance, there's only 1.7% foreigners in Japan, but 2.4% of the foreigners join national health insurance, and they receive 3% of the foreigners receive public assistance. So this is quite a high rate, and this is reported in newspapers, so probably you know. But the newspaper reports like some instances where the foreigners abuse the system and report on it. But I think we have to focus on the fact that Japan has a good national health insurance and public assistance for foreigners. And there are new measures taken. July last year, we started foreign residents inclusion into basic resident registration. And last year, July, the reduction of minimum requirement of premium payment from 25 years to 10 years. So foreigners who have not lived in Japan, now there's an incentive for them to join this system. And the Social Security and tax number system will start in January 2016. So by having such good measures, we will have more foreigners join the national health care or pension system. And the short-term migrants, there are some important points, and that is the Social Security agreements. And the countries in red, we have already this Social Security agreement with 14 countries. And those already signed or under negotiation, that totals 11 countries. So there's negotiation with each country. So if a young Thai comes to Japan and they pay the pension premium, then they go back to Thailand, then they can get the combined pension from Japan and Thailand. So this is a very good system, and we will expand the agreement with other countries. And so we also have the resident registration system and the family registration system, and we also have very rigid foreigner resident registration. So I think if we have a good social security coverage for foreigners, Japan would have really a good system for for foreigners. Now we have to look at the international migration in Japan from historical perspective. Professor Kito will elaborate on this point later. Japan, people think, is just one ethnical people living, but Japan is really has a multiple ethnics, and from 19th century to 20th century we had emigration to New World, because at that time too much population was the issue. So now we have, as I said, like Japanese Brazilians or their descendants are coming back to Japan. And also there was colonial migration before and during World War II, and also there was a growth of foreign residents from the end of 1980s. So this is the historical flow. Now, as I said, Japan is not just comprised of one ethnic people. So here I looked at why genetic, why DNA. This is handed down to males. And if you look at this Y DNA haplogroup, we do not have any overwhelming dominant Y DNA. In China and Korea they do. So in Japan, as you can see, there are so many different mixes of ethnic people. So, and as you can see from this map, Japan is at the very end of the world, and once people come to this island, they couldn't go anywhere else because of the Pacific Ocean. So the culture is that we have to get along well within this archipelago. And now, talking about this modern area, geographical distribution of the foreign population in Japan. Professor Ishikawa will talk about this later. So there's an uneven distribution of foreigners in Japan. And with the aging population and low birth rate, what kind of roles can foreign residents play? Professor Ishikawa will talk about it. Main areas with large foreign populations, these were the areas with lots of industries and services. So there was a low level of aging and low levels of population decline. So we do not know whether foreigners could put a stop to low levels of aging. But now, in non-urban areas, we will see higher levels of aging and population. So what roles will foreign population play in stopping that kind of trend becomes more important. Now, about the international marriage, Professor Inoue will talk about this later. This international marriage has declined from 2007, especially where a foreign husband and Japanese wife. This is stable. However, Japanese husband and foreign wife, that has declined as well. So there's a decline in international marriage. And the young foreigners, like 0 to 14, these are children born to foreign people in Japan, but they were born and they were raised in Japan. But now we see increase of children who cannot really speak Japanese fluently. So some children are not going to school, and sometimes people enter school after they finish the compulsory education, and some do not join the healthcare. So these kind of statistics are now collected in cities and towns where the population of non-Japanese children is relatively large, but I think we have to collect this kind of data nationally. Now we'll talk about the Japanese model and future prospects. I will just talk about 2 pages. Is international migration controllable? Professor Akashi will talk about this. If you look at other countries around the world, they have migration policy, but now they see an outcome which is not intended. So in Japan too, there is a gap between the immigration policy and reality. And also, the migration policy is incomplete in nature, and OECD is starting policy review of the countries. So we would like to discuss about this. So what is the Japanese model? There are 3 points I think I'd like to mention. One is that foreigners' percentage is low in Japan when you look at Japan's economic level, and there's a historical background that is different from USA, UK, Canada, or Australia. And Japanese language is also a barrier. So that's one thing. 10 years ago, we had this seminar, and that was 2003, and we talked about the decreasing population in Japan, what we should do about the foreigners policy in Japan, and we talked about replacement migration. So there was a proposal for replacement migration, but at that time we knew that replacement migration was not enough to put a stop to the decreasing population in Japan. And from 2009, we see a decrease in foreigners. So because of the Lehman shock and the earthquake, we see a decrease of immigration already. So I think we need a policy where we really need the foreigners who come to Japan to really settle in Japan. So we need an integration policy so that they can join Social Security and Japanese language education and so forth. So we'd like to discuss about this point too. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayashi.